Hi, this is Kirsten Murphy, Executive Director of the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council. Yesterday, our council approved our federal fiscal year 25 budget. Unfortunately, some of that presentation was a little hard for folks to hear, so I've been asked to redo the presentation in a video format. This can also be seen by members of the public who want to know more about how the council uses its federal funding. So I will begin by sharing my slide deck. Things to know about budgets in general. So please be aware that when we present our budget to our council, we try very hard to make it understandable in plain language, even though it's a complex document and has a lot of numbers in it. So we try to keep this presentation pretty high level. We're always happy to take questions from the public about our funds and to provide more detail if that's something anyone would like. So in thinking about what a budget is, we start by explaining that it is a plan, right? It's a plan for how the council is going to manage its money during a specific, in this case, 12-month period. Now, when I sit down to write the budget, I have to make predictions about how much money we're going to take in, that's income, and how much money we will need to spend to meet all of our obligations as an organization, all the things that we have to do. I don't just guess when I'm making those predictions. They're usually based on checking about what kind of contracts we have in place that obligate us to spend certain amounts of money. And on if that's not in place, then I look back at the history of what we spent in a particular category. So budgets are really not just best guesses, they really are based on facts. And a good budget is one that is pretty ends up being pretty close to what actually happens in the year that the budget is tracking. The other thing I like members to understand is that when we talk about the money we're spending or expenses, there are two types of expenses. And this is important in the case of the council because a lot of our expenses fall into the first category. That first category is fixed expenses. These are costs that the DD Council doesn't really have that much control over. For example, salary for our 3 staff members is pretty carefully prescribed or set up by state rules. And typically, the legislature decides what kind of an annual increase staff will receive. It's a little different for Susan and Chelsea versus myself because we're in different categories of employment. But in general, those things are decided by the legislature, and we don't have a lot of wiggle room about that. Another good example of a fixed expense is something like rent. We have a lease with our landlord, and that commits us to spending a certain amount of money each year for the space that we use for our office. And that amount of money goes up by a small amount, roughly 3% each year. That's locked in our lease, and there's not, again, something we can do to change that. A third example would be fees. Many of the services that we rely on the state of Vermont for are not free to the council. We have to use our federal money in order to buy those services. So, for example, the fact that we have computer systems that are hooked into the state system with all of its protections and language access capacities and website platforms and things like that, we pay a fee for that. It's not free to us. Similarly, support from the Human Resources Department is something that we pay a fee for. And actually, another example would be the fact that we pay dues to our national association. And again, those dues are set by the association, and we can either pay them or not be a member, which is not something we would choose to do. So a lot of our expenses are in that fixed category. On the other hand, we have discretionary spending. That's kind of a big word, but what it means is costs that we have some control over. We don't have to make any given grant. And if we don't have the money to make grants, unfortunately, then we don't make them. Last year, we chose not to have the leadership series because we didn't feel that we had enough money in our accounts in order to cover the pretty significant costs for that particular program. This is discretionary spending, or spending that we can make choices over. And typically the group that guides that is our program committee, a subcommittee of the council. So really it is the council's decision how we use that discretionary money. All right, so now here are a couple other things I want you to know specifically about the DD Council's budget here in Vermont. So we're going to be talking about the budget, which is the money that we get from Congress each year. So this is called an appropriation, and it's part of the big federal budget that Congress passes, sometimes not in a very timely manner, but that Congress adopts each year. Our council is one of, I think, 11 minimum contribution states, meaning states with the smallest populations in the country, and we get a minimum appropriation, the smallest amount of money that a state council can get, and that's $520, roughly $1,000 a year. It is widely understood across our network that that's not really enough money to run a statewide DD council. But that minimum amount has not been going up over quite a considerably long time. When we get our appropriation from Congress, we have 2 years to spend it. And if we don't spend it promptly in those 2 years, we have to give it back to the federal government, which is something we never want to do. We want to make the most of that money and use it in the best way on behalf of Vermonters with developmental disabilities. And finally, I just want to say again that a little bit more specifically, the amount that Congress has invested in DD councils across the network has not changed really at all in the last 6 years. And even before that, it was not keeping pace with inflation. Additionally, the way that pot of money is distributed across the 56 state and territory councils is done by a complicated formula. And that formula has protected us from losing money, but it has not acted in favor of minimum contribution states like us. So we've really not been at the top of the list insofar as there's any extra money across the network to distribute. It hasn't been coming to councils like ours. So we really are very challenged when it comes to managing our core operating budget. So this is the slide where I want to break it down for you a little bit and show you how fixed and discretionary money works across what we have to spend. At any given year, we have about $600,000 to support us. Most of that's our appropriation from Congress. Some of it's held over from previous years. Don't worry too much about where that came from. Just think of it as 6 blocks of money. Now, once we start paying our fixed expenses, like salary and benefits for just our 3 employees, we have already spent 4 out of 6 of those pots of money. We've spent 2/3 of the money already. And then on top of that, we have to run our office. Again, those are fixed expenses. And we have to support our council members to do things like go to the conference in July and have some stipends, transportation support, training, that kind of thing. So that eats up about another, a piece of square number 5 there, right? So when all is said and done, the amount of discretionary money that we have is, I'm just kind of giving you a visual here. It's about $120,000. It's that thing in the yellow circle, not a big chunk of our budget. So you would have every right to say right about now, hold on, Kirsten. If we only have a small amount of money, for grants and projects, how are we ever going to make our 5-year plan work? Our 5-year plan has 13 objectives. It's very ambitious, and we only have a small amount of money to invest in those objectives. So let's stop for a minute and think about that. First, some of our fixed expenses support the 5-year plan. In fact, large chunks of staff's salary, all of Susan's salary, here she is scooping ice cream at our ice cream social, but she does a lot more than scoop ice cream. She's always at the State House. 100% of her salary supports 5-year plan activities. And more than half of my salary supports 5-year plan activities. So just because something is a fixed expense doesn't mean that it isn't serving those 13 objectives in our 5-year plan. In fact, over the years, we've learned that it is a better investment to spend money on in-house staff and to do projects with the expertise of a strong staff than it may be to grant money out where we have a little less control. And sometimes those projects can be a little more experimental and we're just not, as able to get exactly the outcomes we're looking for. So we have to have a balance. We do grant out some money, but we have also learned that it's sensible strategy for a small council like ours to invest money in staff and have staff try to implement pieces of the 5-year plan. Another important thing to know is that there is other money available to the DD Council. It doesn't show up in the budget that we're talking about today. These are, I call them project budgets. Usually these are pieces of other federal grants that the state of Vermont has taken in. So for example, about a year ago, our council was one of the lead writers in an application for a $10 million grant from the Rehabilitation Services Administration in the federal government. And Vermont received that grant. The council is not the entity that holds all of that $10 million, but we will be drawing down about $354,000 of that money over the next 4 years to support 3 objectives in our state plan. So that's a project budget. It's another piece of money that we access, not only for direct project expenses, but actually for things like a piece of my salary, right? And we have several other pretty good-sized projects like that. Money that we've gotten to support our inclusive healthcare project, much of which came from the Vermont Department of Health. Money that we have to support regional teams at designated agencies who are working to make their services more culturally and linguistically competent. That's another project where we're a pass-through for that money. In fact, the DD Council has, over the past 3 years, secured more than $700,000 in these extra project budgets. So there is some other money out there that we're using really aggressively to meet our 5-year plan goals, but it's not going to show up in the budget that I'm going to ask you to approve today. All right, so before we turn to the proposed budget for federal fiscal year 25, which starts this coming October, I usually like to talk with the council for a few minutes about how well did we do predicting what we were going to take in and spend during this current year, which is federal fiscal 24. The good news is that the council stayed really pretty closely within the limits of its $600,000 budget. We spent about $400,000 of that on salary, another $45,000 keeping the office running, sending Susan and I to some conferences, paying for occasional transportation costs, fees, things like that. Another $18,000 that we spent on supporting our council members, especially the annual conference, which during this past year was the conference that we went to in Florida. So we spent all in all about $450,000 $60-ish $1,000 on those fixed expenses, much of which also went to support our 5-year plan by staff doing that work. And on the discretionary spending side, the side where we have a little bit more say over how the money gets spent, we took about 71,000 of that money, which totaled around 130, and we spent about 71,000 on some grants and projects. We try not to spend all of the discretionary money, and this is a third important point about sort of the principles that we use when we're organizing our budget. We try to keep between $60,000 and $70,000 in a kind of emergency fund, so that if a really important opportunity, or on the more negative side, a significant emergency like a pandemic or a cut from Congress happened, we would have a little bit of a cushion in order to manage that pressure on our budget, right? So we try to hold over between $60,000 and $70,000 and hang on to that money, which we then spend in its second year, and then we replenish that kind of fund each year. So we just try to keep that cushion in the budget. All right. So here's where I'm going to present at a very high level the spending for the federal fiscal year 25 budget. Again, if you want to see more detail in any of these categories, we're happy to provide that. How much money do we think we're going to take in starting on October 1? We are tracking carefully how the budget process is moving through Congress, and we are quite confident that the best possible case scenario and the likely case scenario is that we will be flat funded. We will get about what we got last year. And so we're being told to expect that as a minimum contribution state, we will get about $526,000 from Congress. Now, we also have remember I said there's that cushion, right? We carry over some money from the previous year. Usually that's about $60,000 to $70,000. This year it's higher. Why is it higher? Good question. Without getting into too much detail, remember that I said that if we don't spend money within 2 years, we have to give it back to the federal government. For a while now, I've been having a conversation with our business office about some money from federal fiscal year 22, which was a while ago. The business office felt strongly that that money had to be returned, but I've been working with our partners at the Administration for Community Living and their budget office because they've been changing the way they interpret certain rules. And that change in how they're interpreting certain rules is going to allow us to hang on to $37,000 that we were quite worried we would have to send back to the federal government. So that meant that this year's carryover is higher than usual. It's higher by about $37,000. The other thing that I account for as income is the fact that some of those, remember those other budgets, those other bags of money, some of that money is going to go to pay for the cost of my salary in particular, and to some degree Chelsea's salary. Conservative estimate is that's $15,000. So that's other money we're pulling in that's going to pay for some of the core expenses that go into this core budget, our core operating budget. When all is said and done, we expect we're going to have close to $640,000 for this coming federal fiscal year. Now we start backing out costs. Remember that I said every year the state and the legislature decide if salaries are going to be increased a certain amount, really just to keep up with inflation. So it's not really like we're getting more money. Our spending power is staying the same. It's because costs go up, they have to increase salary a little bit. So, because inflation has been running a bit high, that increase is 4.5% across the board. So for the 3 staff, there will be a 4.5% increase, and that means that instead of costing $400,000, salary and benefits is gonna cost more like $420,000. So that's our first big ticket spend, right? And when we get done with that, our pot is a lot smaller. We're down to about 218,000. Sorry, I jumped the slide ahead. 200 and almost 219,000. Well, then again, we have to pay for the office, which we are keeping those expenses as close to last year as we possibly could, even though the rent will go up a little bit. So that's about 47,000. And then we do have a one-time reduction in how much it's going to cost us to support council members next fiscal year, federal fiscal year. And the reason for that is that our national association has already announced that they are not going to hold a national conference, not this coming July, but a year from this July. Conferences are becoming more and more expensive and challenging to organize. And because our national office is going through some leadership transitions, they want a year to think about what the most effective event will be and whether that's annual or it turns out to be every other year or how that's going to work. So they're going to take a year off from doing that conference. We hope that we'll be able to send members to some other training opportunities. We built in a little bit of money for that, but in general, that's not going to cost nearly what it costs to take a team of us to our national conference. So we are able to predict reliably that for council expenses, the amount is going to drop down to closer to $10,000 just for that 1 year. So those are the other fixed expenses. We back those out, and now we're down to more like $160,000. So again, the pot keeps getting smaller down there in the bottom right. Now we're going to talk about our discretionary expenses. In general, I like discretionary spending to go through a process where our program committee looks at that. And then they make recommendations to you about what grants they want to make. However, I think because we got that extra $37,000 from 2022, I'm comfortable committing us to having the leadership series this coming year. There's a lot of pent-up demand for that. People really want to see that back. But a lot of people asking, when is that happening? So I feel comfortable with your endorsement going ahead and building $35,000 into this budget to cover that cost. The reason I need to do that now is because in order to get the contracts in place for that series, which happens beginning in the fall, I need to start working on those contracts now. So I need to know that we have your approval. So while some of the discretionary money will be, how we use that will be decided later through our process with the program committee. In the budget I'm presenting today, I am asking you to agree to $35,000 for leadership. And then we always try to build in about $5,000 for the ways in which we support some of the statewide conferences like Voices and Choices and Family Networks Conference, the Buddy Walk down in Southern Vermont. There's a handful of things where we support those partner projects. So that would still leave about $122,000 of discretionary money. Remember, we're not going to spend all of that, or at least I wouldn't recommend that you do that. You're going to want to put some of that into that $60,000 to $70,000 emergency fund. But there's a little bit of room for the program committee to talk about and make recommendations by next September about what they want to do with a piece of that money. So this is the overall budget that I'm presenting, and I have asked yesterday that our council make this motion to adopt the budget as presented, which they did with the majority of members voting in favor. We sometimes do revise the budget as we get more information, but this should be a pretty good general sense of how we're going to be using our congressionally appropriated resources during federal fiscal 25. Thanks so much for watching and for your support of the Developmental Disabilities Council.
Advocate, change, join.